Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Purple Political Breakdown. How's it going? How's your day been? We're back at it again. Today, I want to talk about, with my guy here, Danny, what is going on with Ukraine, Russia. I mean, this is the topic of conversation. There have been several meetings in regards to it. So there's a lot to talk about there. And there's been a looming narrative in terms of Putin is so intelligent for this, saying that, man, Donald Trump, if you were president instead of Joe Biden, this war never would have happened. So we'll talk about that as well on our different perspectives and opinions regarding that. But of course, you got myself, you got Danny. How's it going on?
I'm doing good, doing good. Thanks a lot, Riddell. Had a pretty good week, so can't complain much. This has been a very interesting topic, however, to follow over the last few days, so to speak. A lot of information coming out.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, I pay attention to it because of how it relates to the United States. I'm more of a United States guy feeling on what we're doing. But it's good to have you here because you're big in European history and you care about this issue quite a bit.
Yeah.
Are you like deep into? Because I would say I know. I'm not an expert in terms of Ukraine history. I know a bit on how it relates to the United States, but like, are you big into the relationship between Russia and Ukraine and their history?
Yeah, I've been. In grad school, I primarily focused on German history. I'm definitely not technically an expert on I'm not even technically an expert in that, but I mean, I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to Slavic relationships. But when you study German history, you inevitably come across the Russians a lot and the different ethnic groups between between the German Empire as well as then at one point the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Because of that, I've learned quite a bit about this, and I've gained, because of this war, I started reading more and more about their relationships, reading books on it, documentaries, so on and so forth. And this is more or less just a continuation of Russian history, is what I best describe it as. And that seems to be what Vladimir Putin is trying to do. He's trying to go down as one of these great Russian czars, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. I think from how he's been acting, his behavior, some of the things he said, that it seems to me that he wants to recreate the Soviet Union in his image. So we'll see how that kind of plays out. But where do you think the best way to start? Should we start from like the beginnings of the conflict, how it kind of started, or do you want to start from like new stuff and then work our way backwards? What do you prefer?
I think we can briefly talk about the 2014 Maidan protest. So, first of all, what should be noted is it was about trying to oust President Viktor Yanukovych, who had maintained very close relationships with Russia. And ostensibly, in 2014, Ukraine holds this massive election. A bunch of Yanukovych wins, and people did not see that as a legitimate win in effect. So there's a lot of protests that go on in the streets, and this eventually effectively results in him getting ousted. And he gets ousted from power. Ukraine comes in with a more pro-Western, pro-NATO EU government. And then this ends up resulting in effectively Russia seeing this as a threat to them because they don't want Ukraine to form closer relationships with the West. We can talk about that history a tiny bit too. But ultimately, this ends up culminating in Russia sending in little green men, as they were called, to the Crimean Peninsula. And the reason for that is Crimea had been part of Russia for a long period of time historically. A lot of people there did speak Russian, but what should be noted is Crimea was given over to Ukraine. I want to say actually, and I could be. It was given over to Ukraine definitely in the 1990s, following the independence of Ukraine from the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But effectively, Putin wanted to make it a big deal to get that back. And now, of course, it's a big deal for Russia to get Ukraine back, is their argument. But to put it simply, they send in these soldiers, little green men, not wearing Russian military uniforms, or rather, no Russian military labels. So this could grant the Russians a level of, gosh, what's the word for it? I'm blanking on it. Oh, so it could basically grant them the idea of, we are doing this. Plausible deniability. It would give the Russians plausible deniability. And then the next thing we see is them supporting these Russian independence movements in Donetsk and Luhansk, who are claiming, which is in far eastern Ukraine on the border of Russia, with the claims there that, hey, what we are trying to do is set up our own independent people's republics effectively. But those were very much so effectively backed up by the Kremlin. Fast forward to 2022, we know what happens. Russia marches in, tries taking Ukraine very quickly, like a blitzkrieg, so to speak. And that completely halts outside of Kyiv. And fast forward then to September, Russians are actually control less territory now than they did in 2022, which is the ironic thing here. And they're stuck into this endless war. Yes, technically Ukraine is losing territory, but the thing is, Ukraine's fighting a war of attrition, so they just need to hold on to positions, make the Russians bleed, and then fall back to the next position until Russia gives up on this. And now we're seeing that Donald Trump is trying to go off and claim that he can end this war, and is blaming on Joe Biden. That's the short of it.
No, I think you kind of characterized it real well. And then, a little search. That's what it said, 1954, the annexation. I mean, a lot of that was my general understanding. You went in a lot more detail, which I appreciate. And when it came down to it and everything, did you touch upon, I think you kind of referenced on this another part of this history. Did you touch upon the deal that was made to ensure that Ukraine does not join NATO?
That deal, that's, to put it very frankly, a whole load of bullshit. And you only see it being cited by Kremlin sympathizers or Russians who are extremely nationalistic. It's what basically happened is, you had, at the end of the Soviet Union, you have Foreign Secretary, let me pull this up, I always blank on his first name, but his name was Baker, who was under George H.W. Bush and was sent to hold negotiations regarding the breakup of the Soviet Union with Gorbachev. Now, what should be noted is Baker merely suggested towards Gorbachev in those meetings that to maintain positive relationships with the West and the future state of Russia, the United States will not allow NATO to expand beyond the current borders, i.e. effectively beyond Germany. So that would include states like Poland, the Baltics, some Balkan states, so on and so forth, not being allowed to be brought in. Gorbachev says that's I like that idea. Okay. However, Baker does not have any authority to make this decision. That decision has to be left up completely to George H.W. Bush. He comes back to George H.W. Bush with this, and Bush basically says to him, yeah, we're not going to do that. Like, that's completely stupid. We don't even know what the world's going to look like in a bit. So we're not going with it. Nothing got signed. This guy Baker effectively spoke on his own accord and promised, we won't do this. This guy did not have any form of clearance to actually make this go into effect. So it's just basically used by a bunch of pissed off Russians and people that are pissed at the West, who live in the West for various reasons, to try and justify Russia invading Ukraine and act as if Vladimir Putin is not on a bigger conquest for territorial and for expanding Russian territory.
Yeah, I did remember hearing that there was no actual like binding document or a legalized treaty to ensure that this were to happen. And I think another reason why that is brought up is to to give some credence to the United States participation. So, from my understanding, from what I've heard, and from my kind of moral foundation in terms of the involvement in the United States, these are the three primary things I've heard, and let me know what your thoughts are about. Or three primary reasons why I would say the United States getting involved is good. So
Yeah.
obviously, the first reason would be like more of a moral argument, where it's a country is infringing on another country's sovereignty. We live in a different era where these type of invasions is not something we want, and we want to protect the little guy, so to speak. Especially since Ukraine is moving more towards like a Western type style, despite being more of an Eastern European country. There's a lot of favor in that. Another aspect about it is that politically, there's an understanding that Russia taking over Ukraine would also be one, a bad precedent in the sense because there's constant comparison, although different because Taiwan is part of NATO. Taiwan and China, because China is looking at that situation and wants to invade Taiwan for very similar reasons to Russia. And the aspect of Russia taking over Ukraine could also incentivize them to go over to other countries in the Baltics, which is why some of them decided, you know what, we probably need NATO protection. A lot of them was like, yeah, let's join NATO now, because Russia is getting a little too ambitious. And of course, there's the other aspect in terms of mineral gains in the Ukrainian territory as well, which people bring up as in addition to that. And then there's the last aspect of like the Ukraine getting their own sovereignty and everything you mentioned in terms of the history, and then Ukraine ended up not joining NATO. I think there's something regarding nukes that I'm sure you can kind of verify, but I don't remember the specific details. And then there's a like generalized agreement that if Ukraine was in trouble since they didn't join NATO and they didn't get nukes, that the United States would eventually help them. So those are like the main arguments that I understand that are used to basically say United States getting involved makes sense in this situation. Oh, obviously, also the big thing is that Russia is a superpower, and we don't want them to get more powerful as well. So, what do you think about those?
Yeah, well, regarding first of all the nuke situation, um, Russia did agree in 1994 to respect Ukraine's current territorial boundaries with the Budapest Memorandum.
Yes.
And part of that agreement was that Ukraine would give up its nuclear arsenal and hand them over to Russia. Now, with that being said, giving them over to Russia, the United States and the United Kingdom both signed saying that they would also respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. So some people would use the argument that the United States has to get involved and has to effectively back up Ukraine, given the fact that Russia's already broken their end of the deal. So now the United States and the UK have to hold up their end of the deal. But I've also heard a lot of people make the argument that the United States has done a very piss poor job of holding up to their end of the deal, given the fact that Russia did invade effectively in 2014. This war has been going on for, at this point, 11 years. And we've barely done really anything aside for providing military intelligence. Now, of course, it gets complicated because Russia does have all those nukes. And we can talk about how Russians like to use nuclear blackmail on the United States and the West. But I think it's important to keep this in mind that we have more nukes than Russia. We have 10,000 nukes. They have roughly 6,000. Theirs aren't even, we don't even know how well maintained their nukes are exactly. So it's possible like 25% of their stockpile doesn't even actually work. And as I always put it to people, the UK and France alone, who don't have that many nukes altogether, I think about 700, they have enough nukes to make Russia uninhabitable. Like, this isn't really a game you want to be playing here, but the only reason they keep bringing up nukes, etc., and loving that blackmail is because they realize that with Westerners, it scares us more, which is a little ironic because we don't really have all the same history with nuclear disasters. I mean, we do 3 Mile Island, the United States, for example, but that's relatively minor in comparison to what Chernobyl caused. And it's also interesting because Eastern Europeans, especially Ukrainians, are perfectly okay with taking the risk of nukes being used in Ukraine. It seems like when you talk to some Ukrainians, actually, that they'd almost prefer that as opposed to getting annexed by Russia. It's interesting. Now, I don't want to completely say that's true for all of them, but there's not that same fear that we have here. Just put it simply.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
And then in general, I would say because I reasons, and I always put a caveat when it comes to polling because there's a lot of there's a lot of considerations you have to take into in terms of the populace and demographic they're polling, what questions are being asked. But I remember a poll recently that was talking about how a lot of them do want a stop to the fighting, but there's still like, I'd say like 20-30% that still want Russia out of their country no matter what, and will fight to the end. And that I still feel like that is a meaningful percentage at the end of the day. Of course, people want the fighting to end, but what Russia's doing is insane. And there's a level of privilege people in the West, especially the United States, have when it comes down to this because of how protected we are. We have like the greatest military, all that stuff. And we're kind of isolated from a lot of these other situations that tend to happen in countries in Europe and Asia and Africa. Is that we don't really understand what it means to go into war. We understand what it means to send soldiers out. Well,
Yeah.
we don't understand what it means to have it affect our daily lives like this. So, yeah, I'm 100% with you for sure.
Oh, definitely. And with regards to the polling, et cetera, it what it what I'm able to find here, because I've heard about that as well, is 69. The Gallup poll found that 69% of Ukrainians favor a negotiated end to the war ASAP, but only
Mhm.
24% are willing to continue fighting.
Okay.
With an additional 56% saying they would accept compromised end to the conflict, even if it could mean that Russian control is given to certain occupied pieces of territory. Now, the nuance there is, for one, I mean, obviously Ukrainians want the war to end, um, but the other thing is Ukraine is not getting the same Western support. I think last year at about this time, it
Yeah,
was
for
something
sure.
like 70, 80% of Ukrainians wanted to fight until the end, effectively. But they're not getting the same amount of Western support because of the United States, partially. And I think Ukrainians want to, in a way, drag Trump along, so to speak. I think both sides are trying to do this, and I'll talk about that later. Um, but it's also the fact that if a negotiated peace could bring this war to an end, I mean, why wouldn't you take that? If it also means you still get to maintain your sovereignty and, as such, make decisions on what kind of alliances, economic and military, you can form, I could see why Ukrainians favor that. Fact of the matter, though, is Ukrainians also realize they're dealing with Vladimir Putin. He breaks a
Yeah.
lot of these treaties. So I think, in all honesty, we have to kind of look at that as, in the ideal world, if we were dealing with a more reasonable actor here, then we would take a compromised settlement here.
No, for sure, and we'll touch upon that a little bit more so in terms of the comparison of Ukraine and how everything has changed under Trump and Trump's capitulation to Putin, in my opinion. Um, but all right, to kind of round out the reasons, you went over like the nuke stuff. Is there anything else in terms of like reasons that you wanted to give your opinion about?
Well, last thing is the NATO expansion one is an interesting piece because Russia and the U.S. were at one point open in, or Russia was at one point open in joining NATO under Putin, actually. Actually, extremely interesting. If you go back to 2000, the way Putin talks about the United States and the West is extremely positive. You'd think that we were great allies with the Russians all of a sudden, and a lot of people like George W. Bush genuinely believed that Russia was very sympathetic towards the U.S. after 9/11. Citing how there were a lot of similarities between what was going on with the United States with these terrorist attacks, as well as with the war in Chechnya in the 1990s. And finally, the other thing we see that Russia does is, in I want to say 2004, effectively Russia or Vladimir Putin discussed the possibility um, of Russia being invited to join NATO. Now, what's interesting is you don't get invited to join NATO; you have to apply to join NATO. And effectively, the response was, "Well, we have some other countries who've applied to join NATO right now, so we can't really consider you. We can't really just invite you. But if you want to apply, then when we get to Russia, we'll discuss it and then discuss if we want to let you into the military alliance." And some scholars and some quote unquote experts have looked at that as the major turning point for Putin, because slowly after that, uh, Russian media began to become more and more critical of the West, more critical of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, calling out American mismanagement with those wars, or even in certain cases, war crimes, so on and so forth. Whereas before, they were saying nothing but positive stuff about the West, or for the most part. And it's not until, I would say, 2010, I've heard this from younger Russians who are anti-Putin and living in the West, that they can remember a major shift in the Russian public dialogue with regards to the West. That it was roughly around 2009, 2010 that you had Russians all of a sudden saying the West is bad, they're forever our enemy. And that was completely new to them, because they had grown up, like our age as little kids, being told that the West is our ally. So it's a really interesting case here, and it more solidifies this idea that Putin wants full control, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But okay, let's fast forward a little bit. So we understand the reasons why the United States got involved. There's a variety of reasons that you can attach yourself to that I think all have a lot of validity at the end of the day. And then we have what happened in terms of the current Ukraine Russia conflict. And we have obviously Joe Biden as president. And now there's a new sentiment that Putin is attaching himself to. And I can see why he's doing it. This is intelligent manipulation from Putin, saying that if Donald Trump was president, this war wouldn't have happened. And I feel like it's so easy to see Putin's manipulation, but MAGA is still going to use this talking point. Donald Trump has been repeating it time and time and time again. And every time I hear that, I just think of like, how? Like, what exactly were you going to do to stop the war? And the only thing you could have done, well, the only things you could have done is allowed Russia to do what they do and giving no support to Ukraine, or played very strong hardball and say, Ukraine, give up territory to Russia.
Yeah.
So other than that, how are you going to stop Putin from doing what he did? We're yapping.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, Trump wants to see himself as this great negotiator. The Russians know how to manipulate him really well. Keep in mind that I think if you look at like we have Vladimir Putin, who's in the KGB. You have Dmitry Peskov, who's their press secretary, and then you have Lavrov. All those guys have over roughly, we'll go with rounding it out to 40 years worth of experience in this. Putin especially has experience in how to manipulate foreign public opinion and foreign leaders, given the fact that he was in the KGB, although he was stationed in Dresden in East Germany, which wasn't a great spot, apparently, for a KGB operative. Besides that, Trump is going to be easy to manipulate here, because this guy isn't genuinely a politician. He doesn't have understanding of these regions at all whatsoever. And he doesn't understand the nuances of both how Putin speaks or the ethnic issues going on here in this longer history that has arguably gone on for the last 500 years or so between Russians and Ukrainians.
No, I think it's pretty obvious he doesn't understand. Every time there's a question asked to Trump, and there's been multiple times, it was during when Zelensky was here at the White House, and they would ask Donald Trump, do you understand the history? He would filibuster and not answer the question, because obviously he has no idea the history of this region, of this situation. And when it comes down to it, this conflict, we'll start off with like Joe Biden in particular, and then we'll kind of move into Trump a little bit. Is this conflict is, well, I've said it before, not as complicated as like the Israel Palestine. Like Russia's obviously the bad actor in this situation,
Yeah.
even though there's some like people try some weird things in terms of trying to not necessarily sympathize with Russia, but undermine Ukraine to the point where it's like, who cares, basically, trying to equivocate both of the sides and make it seem like it's not a fight worth participating in. One of the big things that I've heard, the two big things that I've heard, and I'm curious your thoughts about it, is that why should we help Ukraine? They have Nazis, one. And why should we help Ukraine? They are full of corruption. They're basically like Russia.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when it comes to why should we help them, they're Nazis, that's completely a Russian talking point. And we can go really far back with that. To put it simply, label, labeling people as Nazis started all the way back in the 1930s when Joseph Stalin came into power. Or rather, I should say fascists, not Nazis at this period of time, until after World War II. So the Stalinist perspective on this was anybody who is against basically my policies, be that Trotskyites or social democrats, we're going to label them as fascists so that effectively I can get rid of them potentially being a threat to my power. We especially see this actually in the Spanish Civil War, which resulted in the Spanish Republicans who were divided among like Stalinists, Trotskyites, and social democrats and different anarchist groups trying to vie for just trying to stop the fascist power, but then also for which leftist ideology they wanted to implement. It slightly undermined their ability to fight back against the Spanish, which ultimately led to them losing. But if you were a social democrat back then, which social democrats are definitely not fascists whatsoever, you were labeled a fascist simply because you stood against Stalin. During World War II, now this is where most Russians cite this coming from. When the Holodomor was going on in the 1930s, the Nazis especially were paying very close attention to this because they want to invade the Soviet Union. They want to occupy this territory, and they also understood this and learned a very important lesson during World War I when the Germans tried to invade the Russian Empire or with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They learned that there are a lot of different ethnic groups there. Not that they hadn't already known that they were there, but that was a big thing. And the Germans, as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at the end of World War I, were the only countries, I believe, who recognized the brief 9-month independence of Ukraine. They had embassies there, for example. So the Nazis see this and they're like, okay, we can use this as propaganda. We'll say that the Russians, or the Soviets rather, the communists, they're starving you to death and they're run by a bunch of Jews. So we're going to use this to get this portion of the population on our side. To a certain extent, that did work, and people sided with the Nazis, seeing them as national liberators. Keep in mind also that this is Europe in the 20th century. Europe is plagued with anti-Semitic history. We can talk about collaborators in all countries, even Russians, but that's a completely separate topic, and I could go off on that for a while. So effectively, the fact that you had people like Bandera, who was a Russian, or not Russian, a Ukrainian nationalist who was willing to work with the Nazis to get Ukraine to be independent, that was seen as a way to that was seen as a way to basically the Russians cite that as saying like, see, all Ukrainians are Nazis because they support this guy. What we also should keep in mind is this is the closest thing Ukraine has kind of right now to a national hero who stood up to the Russians. Hence why I think they like him a lot. Now, fast forwarding nowadays, Russia's just doing the same thing over again. Ukraine's definitely not a Nazi state. They're run by a Jewish guy. They have a democratic society and very strong free speech rights as we are currently seeing with, for example, the the corruption concerns with people protesting because Ukraine was changing some of their was changing how their corruptions can be monitored in their country, and people were protesting about that, as well as the fact that people can speak Russian in Ukraine. Prior to the war, it was totally acceptable. It was recognized as like a second major language, and most Ukrainians are bilingual. So in no way would I say they're Nazis. There are, of course, real Nazis in Ukraine, but there's real Nazis in Russia. Russia supports far-right movements in the United States. They helped, for example, with forming the Unite the Right rally, which we could go into a little bit, in 2017. I mean, the Russians are the ones more closely resembling the Nazis than anybody else, which is the ironic thing. As to corruption, so first of all, if you are against Nazism, I don't know why you are supporting Russia, given the fact that they do support far-right movements, unless you are far-right and you just don't want to call yourself a Nazi. Perhaps that's the what we have going on here. But in regards to the corruption, yeah, Ukraine does have a problem with corruption. I'm not going to deny that. I still don't think that Ukraine deserves to be invaded and people should have rockets fired at their homes. And I still don't think that because of Ukraine having corruption, that means they don't have a right to defend themselves in any way. I mean, the way I see it is part of the reason this corruption issue has remained so major for the country is because Russia invaded the country in 2014, forcing Ukraine to not be able to focus all their attention on getting rid of their corruption issues. In fact, it's a little ironic. A lot of these oligarchs in Ukraine, some of them came up actually thanks to the Russian loyalist governments going back to the 90s and early 2000s. So I see it as this is an issue that's a domestic one. Ukraine needs to take care of it, but they're not able to take care of it very effectively right now because they are fighting a war for their very existence.
I think that's a very, very fair point. It's really hard to focus on certain issues. I mean, we see right now where a lot of the issues from the left right now is just to battle Donald Trump and what he's doing to the country. So there's really hasn't even been focusing on other policy issues. So it just makes sense at the end of the day when you have Russia knocking on the door for consistently for the last decade plus, that it's hard to kind of fix things inside when you have an outside threat constantly. So these are definitely the big talking points when it comes down to Ukraine. Obviously, the other ones, there's a little bit more innately selfish in the ideas of, we should focus here instead of funding there. I always disagree with that claim. I think the United States is capable of doing both, domestic and foreign, and it kind of has to be the number one superpower in the world. So I never really believed in that talking point. But we move forward when it comes down to the Joe Biden administration, and you kind of touched upon it, so I'm curious to see your thoughts on it. But in terms of how they aided it, obviously they sent aid to Ukraine, mostly weapons they were sending over to Ukraine. Not a lot of it. People try to claim they were just throwing dollars at them. That's just not true. And obviously you also mentioned, which is also true, military intelligence, which is another big thing. One thing that was constantly pushed back is that people did not want Ukrainian or American soldiers on Ukrainian soil. Obviously, that never happened. So this was just funding, and obviously, the United States putting pressure on other European countries. And they were also sending funding. The EU was sending a lot of funding as well because there was a consolidated effort to ensure that Russia doesn't just take over Ukraine because it sets a bad precedent and everything that we just mentioned. But overall, when it comes down to it, one of the biggest reasons boots were not put on the ground is obviously because of the fear of the infamous term World War III and nuclear war. People just did not want that type of conflict with Russia. And I understand it to the point, it's really hard to convince the average American and make them understand when it comes down to nuclear threats and what it means because of all that fear mongering that Russia has done. And you've touched upon this too, so I'm sure we'll get into it eventually, how much Russia has seared their teeth into our media. It's disgusting. I'm gonna be honest. They've done a lot of fear mongering here, but ultimately, when it comes to Joe Biden and the Democrats' efforts, they've been helping Ukraine. I think Joe Biden only did like one. No, I know for a fact he did one sit down for Putin, but no other like negotiations were good because for the most part, the United States was on the side of Ukraine and all the European countries were on the side of Ukraine. Russia, get the fuck out of the country. We're not giving you shit. Um, so how did you feel about Joe Biden and the Democrats,
I
or
mean,
Joe Biden and his administration's like support to Ukraine?
well, Joe, he definitely. I have to. Uh, I have to thank him for having tried to back up Ukraine as much as he, with what he did. He did provide that $60 billion aid package this
Mhm.
last year, and because of, but that got held up in the House. He couldn't get it passed because Joe did not want to do was as a president he didn't do too many executive orders, which was really interesting to see. Um, but that got held up in the House partially because of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and the we'll just call them the MAGA caucus, the MAGA Republicans, trying to make it as painful as possible to get the weapons and aid sent to Ukraine. So I put a lot of the blame on the Republican Party. I would say the Republican Party is overall right now making the world a more dangerous place to the Russians and arguably even the Chinese, which is hilarious given that they love to call themselves a party of Reagan, but they've shit the bed with that one. Another thing is, however, Joe Biden did not go into this with the idea of Ukraine needs to win this war. He went into this with what we need to do is make it so Ukraine can defend itself, and that is it. He was far
Fair.
too hesitant on giving Ukraine the exact military aid they needed immediately, which possibly could have ended
True.
this war in 2023, I would say. Um, but he didn't do that because he was scared that Russia was going to use a nuke because Russia kept saying that. And so, but what's interesting is you see Biden gradually crossing all of Putin's red lines, like don't send tanks, or else we're going to use a nuke. We send tanks. Then Russia's like, okay, well, don't send, or I think it was Patriot systems first, then tanks, so on and so forth. And it's not going to happen because Russia knows if they use a nuke, then they start World War III, and they're not going to be able to successfully fight off NATO alliance. As well as they know that China and India are going to cut off diplomatic relations with them for doing that. So they're completely isolated. They're pariah state completely at that point. So ultimately, he was a much better president at it. I would rather have Kamala in office dealing with this. She would not be going through these stupid motions of entertaining these peace talks with Putin, which aren't going to happen. I don't believe they're going to happen. And she would just give Ukraine aid and probably put more sanctions on to crush the Russian economy.
Yeah, I would have to really go back and look because you're correct. And even Zelensky mentioned the fact that he didn't really try to, because he doesn't try to criticize the United States for obvious reasons. He tries to be political with it, but there was a mention how the United States did take a while to send certain weaponry to Ukraine to really be able to kind of deal with Russia. So that is true, and that was a good thing to point out. When it comes down to, we're kind of fast forwarding into the current situation where like Donald Trump has taken hold, and this is the other thing before I even get to the Donald Trump. So I didn't look into this too much, but I'm trying to remember the severity of the sanctions I know he did it. I wonder how hard he played that card, sanctions and tariffs. The thing is, when it comes down to it, the difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration is that Trump is vocal on everything he does and does not do, making it seem like he does do stuff. So he just like says stuff that he's doing or just trying to take credit for. So you can always kind of pinpoint like certain actions at the very least in terms of the timeline of what Trump is doing. Sometimes you can't do that with Biden's administration. They're not as vocal in certain actions that they're committing in terms of policy or just political actions in general. So, from your understanding, like in terms of the severity of the sanctions and tariffs, do you think he was playing hardball enough? Because from my general understanding, like I said, this is not a super thing I focused on. It didn't seem so. What's your thoughts?
With regards to Trump?
No, with regards to
Oh,
Biden's
Biden.
administration in terms of
Biden.
sanctions tariffs on Russia.
Yes, they should have. Honestly, I think what. Okay, so the sanctions take a while to go into place. That's a big thing with this. And I'm not an economics guy. I've tried paying attention to it, and there's some information I've definitely been able to gain from it, but it goes a lot deeper than that. To put it simply, Russia has, well, so Russia's biggest trading partners at first were effectively the European Union, and that has now completely changed to it being India and China. And with putting these sanctions on, it takes a bit for them to start to hit and hurt the Russian economy. What we're seeing now is that they have started to hurt the Russian economy. It took about 2.5 to 3 years for us to really start to see this, because we're seeing stagflation in Russia currently, which is impossible for their central bank to effectively get them out of. Part of that is also because Russia, after 2022, if you remember this, mobilized, I want to say it was about 300,000 soldiers or civilians from the Russian population to go fight in Ukraine. And 250,000 people left the country. Actually, I have at the time I was trying to learn Russian, thinking about doing that for grad school, like to talk about Soviet history as well, when I go to get my PhD. But what's interesting is I talked to a lot of Russians who actually left during that period of time. They said, I'm not going to die for Putin. Like, this guy does not represent our interests. He's fucking over our country. This guy's a fascist. Actually, is what one of them specifically told me, who was from Novosibirsk in far northern Russia. So they went to Kazakhstan. So that was a big thing that happened. So what does Putin do in that situation? Well, he says, okay, we're going to have a voluntary military force where we'll agree to pay you the U.S. equivalent of $66,000 a year. Now, that really increases the salary for these average Russians living outside of places like St. Petersburg and Moscow. By the way, St. Petersburg and Moscow, anything you hear is really great about Russia from a Westerner, they've probably only actually been to St. Petersburg and Moscow. The rest of the country is, from what I have seen on the internet and watching different YouTube videos, it looks very underdeveloped, to be nice about it. As Trump would say, it's a shithole. But people there, I saw one video that really stuck out to me. One woman who worked on the Trans-Siberian Railway made $200 a month. Now, that was barely enough for her to be able to afford rent and be able to afford groceries living in Siberia. Nowadays, her husband, likely with this taking that contract, making $66,000 a year. So imagine going from making $25,000 to suddenly making $66,000 like that, and this is happening to a huge amount of your population. That causes inflation. And that makes it so these people are like, we're going to fight for the money because we want to be able to provide for our families because we live in horrible conditions. The problem is that doesn't last long. That lasts so long as the war lasts. And Russia's already struggling, as we're seeing, with providing, for example, even food in their country. They're considering putting in price controls for food, which is almost always a sign that your economy is about to go over. Actually, to look back at World War I, that was one of the big signs with Germany during World War I that they were fucked, is when they started putting in price controls, which led to food riots across Germany, and partially led then to the overthrow of the German Empire. So ultimately, yes, I'd say these sanctions have had an impact. What Biden should have done, however, is also gone and put sanctions on China, I think, and India. I don't care about getting my Temu shit or whatever. Like, we should have been harder on them to really stamp down on Russia early on.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest part because you're right about that. I also remember how because of everything the United States and the EU were doing, I remember seeing things about like Russia trying to recreate some of the imports they're not getting anymore and create like a Russian version of them for
Yeah.
their country and for their people. I remember that was like something big in terms of the news cycle that Russia was trying to replace the consumer goods in their own way in their country because of how much they're struggling for bringing in imports. And I agree when it comes down to it. That's why Donald Trump's probably going to get a lot of credit for the fact that he did. And this probably was an interesting point for Putin. It's like, hey, maybe I'll do this meeting to stroke this guy's ego because he's doing this regarding putting the tariffs on India or threatening India to not send stuff to Russia with like I think he's like 50% tariffs or something. And I don't remember if he did China. I know for a fact he did India. I don't remember if he did China as well. But I do think if you really want this to be a situation where Ukraine's going to defend herself, you're going to allow them to decide their destiny, but you're going to squeeze as much out from Russia as possible, then yeah, you got to put pressure on every angle of Russia to really put them in place. And that would include obviously India and China. So I think
Yeah.
that's where we are for that. Overall, Biden did what he could have done better, of course. Everybody could do better because the war's still going on. But let's transfer over to the Donald Trump administration. Before we do that, do you have anything else you want to speak about in terms of Biden?
No, that's really it.
So Trump administration now, very different. Obviously, he said he was going to end the war in one day, talking out of his ass, obviously. And he's an individual that we've known for a while who had strong and friendly relations with Putin. And now, in the situation where he said he was going to stop this conflict, he was going to deal with it, he was going to play hardball with Putin, multiple peace negotiations were happening, didn't fall through. And there was a opportunity where it's like, or there was a time where Donald Trump thought Putin was on his side. Then Putin did whatever the fuck he wanted again. And then Donald Trump started crashing out on social media because Putin basically played him like 4D chess. So,
Yeah.
how are we feeling about Trump in this current situation?
I think, to put it bluntly, he is a complete idiot with this. Honestly, this issue is very good proof this guy is not able to represent American interests really at all. I think it's also hilarious seeing that, according to a recent Gallup poll, 67% of Americans support Ukraine, support providing us Ukraine with military support, which is different from what it was when Trump got elected. When he got elected, I think it was more 50-50, and it's actually gone up, which basically shows that Trump is losing some of those people who voted for him on this issue back in November of last year. They see, okay, there is only one way to end the war, and that is by putting pressure on Russia via military and economic means. But I genuinely think Trump does not. It's complicated. The whole idea of him being like Agent Krasnov, etc. Or I understand where that's coming from. I don't think there's enough proof to prove that at all whatsoever. I feel like
What is that?
Okay, so it's a theory that Donald Trump is effectively a Russian plant from the Soviet Union, and that what he is trying to do is screw over the collective West in favor of the Russian Federation. I did say Soviet Union, but the idea is that this policy is continued into using Trump as a sleeper agent effectively into the 21st century. Now, I don't necessarily know if I believe that. What I do think, and there is actual proof of this, Trump does have a lot of very positive relationships with Russian businessmen. Actually, some of the biggest Russian people who invested in Trump Tower in Chicago, I think it was something like $95 million in the Trump Tower in Chicago, were from Russia. They're Russian oligarchs, effectively. So I think Trump partially sees it as, oh, I love the Russians. They've helped me be able to grow my brand and image and get really rich. And I want to keep that going for myself and my family. So I feel like what he's effectively willing to do is screw over Ukraine if it means it will benefit himself in the long run. But he's also facing this issue now where he is a political figure. As I stated, the majority of Americans supporting Ukraine. The majority of MAGA has a negative interpretation, actually, of Putin himself, with it being hilarious if you look at the New York Post on him, going and saying that President Trump had a very successful meeting with Putin in Alaska, but they describe Putin as a tyrant, which is kind of them being subtle and saying, come on, Trump, you gotta crack down on this guy. Like, this guy is not a good dude. You know what to do. We're telling you this is what you need to do. New York Post, Ben Shapiro as well, going off and calling Putin a dictator to try and sway Trump, as well as sway MAGA. And that's had an impact. That's definitely had an impact. But I don't think he's going to listen to his supporters on that because, kind of like with the Epstein files, he has something to lose if the Russian Federation collapses. So I think what he's trying to do effectively is less so save Ukraine and more so save Russia, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I always thought that, and I didn't know about the Russian ventures, business ventures that are investing into his companies. And I mean, it's so easy to understand that Donald Trump cares so much about, making himself richer. I mean,
Yeah.
the easiest thing for the average person to look at is the freaking meme coin. That is the easiest thing. It is literally a coin that has no intrinsic value, that if you invest into it, you get a private meeting with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And we know for a fact that there's been a lot of foreign investments into that coin, a lot of foreigners, foreign individuals, foreign people have got to meet with the president of the fucking United States.
Yeah.
How crazy is that? Yeah, so when it comes down to the situation, Donald Trump cares about his bottom line. I don't know if you saw the recent report about ever since he became president, or everything in regards to his presidency, he's gained about $3.6 billion in profits.
I did see that.
So insane work. I thought we are supposed to keep money out of politics, but I don't know. So I agree with you when it comes down to he's trying to protect Russia. That's why he keeps on trying to do these peace deals to adhere to Putin. But there's also a realization, because he's president of the United States, the image he would have if he just gave Ukraine over to Russia would be disastrous. Like, it would be full blown, what the fuck? Are you just a Putin puppet? Like, what? So he can't do that. He has to try to play it properly. But Putin's ambitions is clear. He wants either all of Ukraine or a good chunk of Ukraine. And I think after the meeting he had with Putin and how they talked, and every time people were asking Donald Trump, what is the deal that you got? And he kept on saying, well, I can't reveal it. I can't say. Nothing is official yet, but it's all in the hands of Ukraine. Sounds to me like you were kind of offering parts of Ukraine to Russia in this deal, but you just don't want to say that out loud. So I think that is the big thing here. And obviously the other part of the deal that will always be on the table is Ukraine wanting security guarantees as well.
Yeah.
Either being part of NATO or having some kind of like relationship with NATO where they can, I don't know, either be on the border or have like people like help them in need, something like that.
Yeah. Well, it's really kind of funny in that sense because he really didn't get anything out of this meeting. I've even seen theories floating around that wasn't the actual Putin, that was rather a double. And one of the reasons for that is because Dmitry not Dmitry Lavrov. Lavrov himself. Sorry, he did most of the talking. If you look at that conversation, Putin barely talks at all. And when Putin does talk, he kind of looks at Lavrov like, we're doing this, right? So some people think that because of that, this wasn't Vladimir Putin. This was somebody else who went with Lavrov, and Lavrov was like, you let me do the talking. You just make it look like you're Vladimir Putin. That's a conspiracy theory, though, more or less. But I believe it. Going forward with that, though, I think the best part about it is this puts Putin into a really weird position because Trump can't pick up on these subtle nuances with Russia. And one of the things, I think he said this yesterday, was that Russia is open to there being an Article 5 solution provided by European countries that would basically mean that, okay, you might get Crimea and let's say Luhansk. We'll give you those territories. Ukraine gets the rest of it back, or we'll give you all the territories. But then we're going to have NATO troops, or who are effectively NATO troops, go and be stationed in Ukraine to prevent you guys from ever invading again. And if you guys do invade, then you'll have to fight, at the very least, the U.S. Air Force, because Trump said he does not want American boots on the ground, but said he is interested in putting the U.S. Air Force there. But you'd fight France, Germany, the U.K., Finland, Poland, etc., who are all right now building up their militaries. Germany recently passed a bill, I believe, for roughly 760 billion euros, which is, by the way, more than the euro's worth more than the American dollar. So that says something. And Germany, with their recent defense spending amount, has said that for the next year, they're putting aside 7.6, I want to say, billion euros to be given to shipments to Ukraine. So the point being is that's not something that Putin's going to take. But Trump believes Putin is going to take it because he thinks that's what they talked about at this meeting. And you even had to have Lavrov today come forward and say, no, we didn't agree to that. Like, what the hell are you talking about? So they don't understand each other. And it's hilarious to watch because you have the Europeans, especially Zelensky at the White House, basically saying to Trump, oh, yeah, you're not going to give up any of that territory. We don't want to fight a war with Russia in the future. We're going to make sure that Ukraine is as strong as possible out of this situation, if not completely destroy the Russian economy. And Trump is just kind of there like, oh, shit, okay, I guess we'll go with that. And then he's saying, well, they did say that they're interested in a negotiated peace. It's not going to happen. And now Russia's planning on bringing in China as a mediator. And Trump hates China so much. This isn't going to happen. What we're going to see is instead this war goes on. More people are going to die because of this. And my genuine prediction is the Russian economy is going to collapse. And we will see the dissolution of the Russian Federation within the next 3 years or so. Given how everything looks right there. I mean, this is pathetic. They said last year we're going to take Pokrovsk by May. And it's been it's been like a year, 5 months or so, 4 months. And they haven't even taken Pokrovsk yet. Yes, they're closing in on that frontline city, but it hasn't fallen. It's pathetic. So, no, Trump, what he should do is shut the hell up. Just keep selling weapons at least to Europe so they can send them to Ukraine, and allow Republicans in Congress like Lindsey Graham to put in this next sanctions package to put more pressure on him. And then if Trump wants, he can pretend he's still friends with Vladimir Putin by saying, hey, I didn't do it. It was Lindsey Graham who did it. And he went through our parliament. What do you want me to do about it? It's fucking dumb. If he wants to stay friends with Putin, though, that's what he should do.
I mean, you're pretty on it. If you were to give like anything in terms of like credit to Trump, and it always hurts me when I have to be like, fine, here you go. You know, this is a unfortunate positive, is that depending on what your perspective is, because there's always these different like conversations in terms of the United States role in the world. But because Donald Trump has become so fucking unhinged and has become so toxic to our allies, they've taken a lot of responsibility onto themselves and now are trying to build, like you said, their military. They're trying to build. There's a lot more young individuals joining their institutions, their colleges, their education system, and scientists as well are joining a lot of these European countries as well. So a lot of the things that you would argue that made the United States great is now making these other countries great. So depending on where you land in the spectrum, there's a lot of more like individuality from these European countries moving forward because of Trump. Um, and they're going to have to take the role of like being in charge of dealing with this conflict because we've talked about it, Donald Trump does not know what the fuck he's doing, and he's just kind of like, man, let's do a peace deal. Let's talk this time. Oh, I was on the phone with Putin. It seemed very happy, and then and then Putin sends drones and attacks Ukraine. Putin, what the fuck? What's going on? I thought you were cool. Like,
Yeah.
buddy. All right.
No, it's completely ridiculous. He has no control over the situation at all. He has no cards to play, as he said, even though he claims Zelensky had none. Or he does have cards to play, and that involves backing up Ukraine, but he's not going to do that. And I agree. The best part about this is it has, one, caused the world to see that Russia is not interested in peace unless you have your head in the sand. It's not interested in it, or very dishonest. It's caused MAGA to see that, which I think is important from a foreign policy standpoint, even though whatever. And the final thing that it has been good with is, in an indirect way, it has gotten Europe to step up its military spending. But at what cost? I don't know. Given my internship and the fact I'm moving to Europe soon, in the Europeans I've talked to, I will say Europeans don't really look at America as an ally now, at least in the general population. The politicians aren't going to say that. But every single European I talked to said, we don't trust you guys. And first of all, what I want to point out is there's been an increase in the number of Europeans wanting to form a separate military alliance outside of the United States because of this. And the other thing is, which I found really interesting, according to Ipsos, which is a German polling agency, 62% of the German population now supports bringing back a mandatory military service, with men who would be the ones who would be most impacted by that, it being a total of 69% of men in support of bringing it back. And the other thing that I thought was interesting is, when I was there, a lot of German men I talked to were saying, like, oh yeah, I am ready to serve my country, which kind of goes against these polls from a couple of years ago. But it's definitely caused a change in Europe. And it was the amount of military recruitment posters I saw in Germany, Austria, and even in Italy, in northern Italy, that just had me thinking, like, wow, these guys are like actually basically gearing up for war. And European analysts are also looking at this and saying this might be the last summer of peace, as they put it. So we need to build up our armies and start buying and producing weapons. The Poles, got to give it to them. They spend more on their military now, or with GDP to NATO. I think 4.7% now. Ours is like 3.5%. And they have a massive tank fleet, effectively, of South Korean tanks. And apparently South Korean tanks are up there. But yeah, and the other thing I want to point out is, kind of going off the tank aspect there, we're seeing European countries are becoming even more hesitant now about buying American weaponry. We saw that from Portugal, for example. They were about to buy a batch of F-35s and turned that down to buy some Rafale jets from the French because of Trump turning off information's intelligence sharing, which rendered a lot of weapon systems in Ukraine useless to the Ukrainian military. So that's all caused a wake-up call, and Europeans to effectively look at it as the U.S. is not a reliable ally. We need to find something. We need to build up our militaries. And I wouldn't even be surprised. I have no proof of this, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see Europeans saying we need to build nukes as well to protect ourselves from the Russians and even maybe the Americans.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
funny.
I've been hearing it's crazy. I've been hearing that sentiment as well, and this is why I tell people that the United States has a role, and now we're seeing the backlash of this whole idea of I forget the term, I being like an isolationist. Um, and Donald Trump is so terrible. He is ruining our image all across the world. Even though the MAGA likes to lie, he's like, "Oh yeah, everybody respects us." No, no, it's not. No,
No,
everybody does not respect us. Donald Trump is horrible, not only in the European countries but other countries as well. They
I
just
mean,
have a bad outlook on the United States now, and where our tourism numbers is also down
oh
as
yeah,
well. So our image is tanking. One thing that I feel like does not get appreciated much, um, and honestly, I appreciate it more now looking how bad Donald Trump is ruining our reputation. Is like Joe Biden spent a lot of time rekindling our relationship after
oh
Donald
yeah.
Trump's first presidency, like a lot of time, and he did a lot of good work. And then Donald Trump just ruined it all in like 6 months. It's like, oh my god, like damn.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. And, this is talking about specifically European relations. We're not even getting into, actually, if you want to talk a little bit about Asian, we can. It's funny. Uh, the Japanese and the Koreans are now starting to trying to form like their own little trade network that starts to isolate the United States more in favor of China. Um, and some people are looking at that. I don't know if that's gone into effect. I haven't read up on that recently, but I know that in terms of young people like us, that's had an impact on us in a way because it resulted in after the tariffs went into effect, immediately Nintendo was like, okay, we're going to boost the price of our consoles being sold in the United States now.
Yeah.
I question if they actually need to do that or if they're like, oh, sweet tariffs. Okay, we're going to use this as an excuse to make some bank on this real quick. Probably more like that. But regardless, it happened, which shows that it's hurting American consumers. I, in a sick way, think it's funny because I think it teaches, I really, really hope it teaches people the dangers of hardcore isolationism this way. It's one thing to be against wars like the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is another thing to be like, oh, we're going to completely cut ourselves off from the rest of the world, which is kind of what Trump's doing in like the most dickhead way, though.
Yeah. And I do think it says a lot in terms of the countries that are constantly praising Trump.
Oh yeah.
Um, I think there are very specific countries that he's very nice to, that he's praising him. Obviously, Israel is glazing the shit out of Trump every chance they can get for obvious reasons.
Oh yeah.
Putin was glazing Trump crazy in their exchange just recently. I don't know much about some of these other countries because again, I don't look into other countries as often unless it relates to the United States. I'm a goddamn filthy American. But like there's other countries that I've seen in terms of I think it was Armenia and was it Azerbaijan?
Yeah, Azerbaijan. Yeah.
They were glazing Trump quite a bit as well, from what I've seen recently.
Yeah, that has more to do with it's Azerbaijan who's especially glazing Trump, but also Armenia. Um, and for Azerbaijan, it makes sense. Azerbaijan and Armenia hate each other,
Mhm.
have for a long time, and Armenia has been for a long time backed up by the Russians, and Azerbaijan has been more neutral. We haven't really done anything there, from my understanding. But now I forgot what it was. Oh, I think it was. It had something to do with oil, with Russian oil, or like the Russians targeting. Oh, it was. I think it was gosh, what was it? Real quickly, it was very recent and pretty big deal because now they're starting to warm up to America. Armenia, Russia, bad relation thing. Real quick, um, it's worsened partially because of the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, as well as what is it for decades. You know what? I'll put it. I'll send it to you. You can put it in the show notes if you want.
Okay.
But yeah, it's very shocking that Armenia, who's had more or less positive relationships with Russia for the last 20-ish years, is now starting to turn towards the United States, which might put them in danger to Russia invading them in the future. Who knows?
Right.
Like what they did to Georgia.
Facts. So basically, how we kind of outlined the entirety of or the most important aspects to understand from an American perspective in terms of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to say that Joe Biden has done a better job in helping Ukraine. And the only way you can argue, because I heard a MAGA moron say this before, because of the new talking point. Oh well, Donald Trump is in charge. He would have stopped it, and the whole idea that these people want to stop. Oh man, the way I hate this, like with a passion, because I think it's so dishonest. The whole idea that stopping the war is the most important thing for all these magtards, and that when it comes down to it, Donald Trump would have stopped it, and they would have saved lives. These MFers don't care about the lives saved. They just want to make Donald Trump look good. Because if
Yeah.
you really dissect this situation, you're sacrificing Ukraine against supposedly one of the United States' biggest enemies, Russia, because you want Donald Trump to win political points? Like, come on.
Yeah, that's basically it. They suck up to Trump. It's really weird, again, seeing it from Republicans. You do see from more traditional Republicans in Congress, like Lindsey Graham, and even to a certain extent from Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, that they do sympathize with Ukraine. But the amount of I just wouldn't. I mean, Republican Party on foreign policy, you can criticize them for Bush, but I definitely at this point be like, yeah, I don't trust you guys on foreign policy at all now after this. Like, you guys are going and sucking. You guys completely flipped, and now you're a bunch of Putinists, effectively, or you're starting to sound like that, and it's quite concerning. It's funny seeing the Democrats be the hard ones on them and not the Republicans anymore.
Yeah, it is kind of crazy to see how the political spectrum has changed, and yeah, it seems like there's a very specific sane side at this point, and from my perspective. But all right, is there anything else you want to touch upon in terms of Russia Ukraine? We've kind of covered quite a bit of it.
Yeah, last real quick point. Big reason a lot of people on the right in MAGA, like the really hardcore MAGA people who are die-hard MAGA, support Russia in this, or will spread that propaganda, is Russia is seen as a white Christian bulwark, and they want to see a politically incorrect, quote unquote, society succeed and overtake the West, which they think has been destroyed by minority groups and gays, so on and so forth. It's fucking stupid. But that's a big reason for it. Best example I can think of, you didn't hear about this, a man from Texas recently moved to Russia to get his kids away from the LGBT indoctrination in Texas.
I know what you're talking about. Yo.
Yeah, and now he is serving on the front lines in Ukraine, probably dead, if I'd anticipate, or going to die soon. But it's the sort of shit we're dealing with. Are you basically it's just, again, funny when they go and call Ukraine Nazis, and then people in the United States who kind of sound like Nazis move to Russia.
Right.
But they're going. But Russia's going the definition: if you're against us, you're a Nazi. If you're with us, you're not a Nazi. So I mean, then I guess he's not a Nazi in the Russian eyes.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I always dislike the woke, like the very aggressive woke stuff. But ultimately, I do think some of some of it has value. But like these people hate it so much, they've deluded themselves
It's,
into sympathizing with Russia just because Russia. I think they had like a recent policy where they banned LGBTQ, like something regarding
yeah,
LGBTQ
they did.
in the country. I'm like, bro, gay people are not, there's other U.S. gay people are not freaking demon spawns. Like, come on, bro. Like,
Oh, it's insane. It's insane to see this, but yeah, that's how like fucked in the head these people are, effectively, and desperate these people are.
yeah, it's kind of insane. So curious to see how everything else plays out. Donald Trump keeps on saying that he is trying to get Putin and Zelensky to meet again, and we'll see how that works out. We'll see how that plays out. Um, Something tells me it's not going to be as generous. I guess last question for you. We'll wait and see to see how or if that actually happens. Last question for you. One thing that I'm concerned for Zelensky is that Donald Trump is obviously an egotistical narcissist. You got to stroke his ego to get what you want. That's what Zelensky did in the second meeting, where people were talking about, "Oh, you're wearing a suit now." Like, oh, okay, all right, bro. Like,
Yeah.
it's just ridiculous. But the big thing that Donald Trump wants to use as his talking point is that if he was president, this war wouldn't have happened. Do you think that I'm sure a MAG reporter will try to ask him this at some point, or maybe even Donald Trump? Do you think two questions? Do you think Zelensky will answer this question the way Donald Trump wants him, or well, and then the other question that's a part of it is like, do you think he should play into Donald Trump's ego? How do you? What is your opinion? How do you feel like Zelensky should respond to this inevitable question? If Donald Trump was president, would this war have happened?
I mean, ideally, I would say he should say no. You wouldn't have. What I think but we're not in an ideal world, and he has to be careful here. Um, I think a smart answer would be, you know what? I like to think that would be the case. Donald Trump is a very strong leader, is what he should say, but then say, I can't say for sure because that would have happened in a different timeline. So we can't really sit back and gather on the past. I'm more focused on the here and now and and how Donald Trump is trying to end the war right now. Is what I would say if I were Zelensky. Um, Sorry, what was the second question then?
Well, it was basically one question. It's
Yeah,
like, how do you think he should respond, basically, or what do you think he would say?
yeah. I think he's gonna say basically, yeah. I wish he could have done it in the past, but he wasn't president then. I'm sure he could have, but let's not think about that right now. It's what he's gonna say. He's gonna be like, nope. Basically, which says to everybody else, no, this guy cannot have stopped the war.
Yeah, I mean, the truthful answer, obviously, he won't say it, but that's why I'm sympathetic to Zelensky's situation. You're in the situation where you're the smaller power, smaller country. Your leverage is freaking dwindling, so you really just got to stroke egos when it comes to Donald Trump. But I do think something to consider for Zelensky is that stroke it, sure, do what you got to do, warm them up, but more than likely a Democrat will be president next time. So you don't want to burn all your bridges.
Oh, yeah, I don't think Democrats are concerned. I think Democrats know what's going on, though. I bet you Joe Biden sits there and is like, "Oh, I know what he's doing. He's doing what he's got to do.
Everybody with common sense like knows
He should know what he's doing."
knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
Oh man. But all right, well, that's all we got for the Ukraine-Russia conversation. If you ever did not understand the history or did not understand the different dynamics between what both presidents provided, I mean, if you ever wondered who would have been who's a better president dealing with this conflict, I think you got our answer here. But obviously, let us know what you think. feel free to, rate the podcast 5 stars. Feel free to share with your friends and family. If you got anything you guys want to say, you can always email me via my email, thetrendgoldenfaith@gmail.com. With that said, hope you guys enjoyed. Y'all have a good one. Take care and peace.